Welcome to the Beef Fuse podcast. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Don, and I'm the host of the podcast. And today we're going to have an exciting guest with us today, Dr. David Katz. And so Dr. Katz is a specialist in internal medicine, preventive medicine, public health, and lifestyle medicine with a particular expertise in nutrition. He earned his BA at Dartmouth College, his MD at Albert Einstein College of Medicine, and his MPH or Master's in Public Health from the Yale University School of Public Health. So with that, let me just bring in my co-host, Dr. Anthony Marotta. Welcome, Dr. Marotta.
Hi, Don. Pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Today's an exciting.
Yeah,
Apologies.
Say, it's an exciting time, right? Go ahead. Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, very excited for today's discussion with Dr. Katz. I think everyone knows him. So we're really looking forward to a very inspirational discussion on nutrition, lifestyle medicine, and I'm sure we'll get into other topics as well.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I know getting prepped for this was, so first of all, I wasn't familiar with Dr. Katz, so I got an entire education in Dr. Katz, working through this. He has a lot of published, books, but then also articles all over the place on LinkedIn and, different sort of places to get information about the things that he's thinking about, as well as key themes with regards to lifestyle medicine. And so I'm very excited as well to get into the topic. So with that, why don't we welcome you, Dr. Katz? Welcome to the show. Great to have you here with us.
Thank you very much, Don. Anthony, good to be with you, gentlemen.
Yeah, thanks so much. So, I mean, just to kind of kick us off, I mean, your bio's extensive. As I said, your writing's all over the place. As I started to dig in more and more, it just seemed like I found a lot of things, some things related to COVID, other things related to lifestyle medicine. And there was a lot of published work out there, and as Anthony knows, I sort of dug through one of your books as well, and so we have a lot of good questions prepared for you today. Would you just kind of share with the listeners a little bit about yourself and what are you focusing on right now?
Well, it's interesting, Don. You mentioned that diversity of topics, and yet I think they're very unified. First, now, as noted, I trained in internal medicine, and then I went on to a second residency in preventive medicine, public health. So the value proposition I've been espousing my entire professional life is let's do what we can to add years to lives and life to years. And over the last 15 years or so, I've added in, and let's also do what we can to save this beautiful planet, because we have some hope of being healthy, vital people on a healthy, vital planet, or we have no hope of being healthy, vital people. So that's one big cluster of topics. And frankly, although I haven't devoted my career to infectious disease in particular, when the world succumbs to a pandemic and your mission is to add years to lives and life to years, you have to divert your attention to the pandemic. That's where the action is. But the other major theme for me is seeing the big picture and the patterns that emerge when we operate at the confluence of science, sense, and expert consensus. And it's not as if experts are always right, and it's not as if any number of experts is reliably right, but experts are filters. If you have genuine expertise, you're better situated to filter the available information than someone without that expertise. And the better the filter, the more likely it is that you catch what you're after. So rather than rely on any one opinion, I've really looked for ways my whole career to rely on the consensus of experts from diverse but related fields. And so I've tried to champion the confluence of science, sense, and global expert multidisciplinary consensus. And so with that in mind, and having lots of training and research methods and reading the scientific literature and having contributed extensively to the scientific literature, I really try to make sense of the science for the public, to strip away the hyperbole, to give people actionable intel, whether that's about diet nutrition, which is my primary focus, or about making your way through the turmoil of a pandemic. So, as you say, I've done the tally, and I lost track at some point, but I wrote a weekly column of about 1,000 words weekly for over 25 years. And during much of that span, I wrote multiple columns a week for different outlets: Huffington Post, U.S. News and World Report, eventually LinkedIn, a number of others as well. It's a very large volume. I think it's something like 30 full length books. Anyway, help yourselves. Google, if I make sense today, just type my name into Google and any topic you like, and there's a chance something will turn up.
I learned that lesson. I mean, there is a plethora of information out there, and like you said, I mean, I felt like there was a good tie throughout. What really inspired you, to pursue lifestyle medicine?
Well, it didn't exist when I started out, and so I rather blundered into it. But I can give you probably a more granular answer than you might expect. A single research publication, a single paper in the Journal of the American Medical Association really shaped the trajectory of my career. I was already interested in fitness and health and nutrition and food, and it had already occurred to me that everybody eats, and what we eat really matters. It's the fuel for our bodies, it's the construction material for our bodies. How can that not matter? High performance bodies clearly are going to require high performance fuel and high quality construction material. It just stands to reason. So I was into all of that. My dad's a cardiologist, and so I kind of had that model in the house. But I trained in internal medicine, learned how to take care of sick people, spent a lot of time in hospitals, and I felt like I was learning how to be one of the king's horses and one of the king's men, right? I mean, we're basically watching Humpty Dumpty fall off the wall over and over again, except it wasn't a wall and it wasn't a big egg. It was people succumbing to heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, dementia, infectious diseases, all of which we knew how to prevent but weren't preventing. And I thought, well, I'm going to do all I can to try and help put these Humpty Dumptys back together again, but we're never going to unscramble the egg. We're never going to restore complete vitality. So I really also want to have a hand in getting at the next cohort before they fall off the wall and see if I can maybe get them to wear a seatbelt and not fall off the wall, right? In other words, preventive medicine. Let's prevent the next round of heart attacks, diabetes, cancer, stroke, dementia, all that mayhem. So I did a second residency in preventive medicine. So I knew I wanted to do that. And I knew I was interested in nutrition. But just within a couple of months of my graduation from my preventive medicine residency and getting my master's in public health at Yale, a paper came out in the Journal of the American Medical Association entitled Actual Causes of Death in the United States. And that paper changed the arc of my career, because essentially what it said was, what gets listed on death certificates, stuff you guys, sleepy medical residents at 3 a.m. in a hospital, write on a death certificate when someone dies of heart disease, is not very illuminating. Someone dies of heart failure due to heart attack, due to heart disease. What questions have you really answered? I mean, what you really want to know is, why did this person get heart disease? So these two authors, Mike McGinnis and Bill Faggy, answered that question. They dug deeper and said the root causes of all the stuff that's killing people prematurely in the United States is, and they enumerated a list of 10 factors. What captured my imagination as a newly minted preventive medicine specialist was that 80, and by the way, those 10 factors together explained almost all of the premature deaths that occurred in this country every year. And they were all modifiable even back then. This was 1993, the paper was published. But the first three entries on the list of 10 by themselves accounted for 80% of the premature deaths and the burden of chronic disease. And they were tobacco, poor diet, and lack of physical activity, or bad use of feet, forks, and fingers. So that's a career. I said, I had thought I was going to be a clinical researcher. I was going to ask the unasked question, boldly go where nobody's gone before. I can't justify it. We already know if we fix these three broken things, we could eliminate 80% of the chronic disease burden we see in the world around us and 80% of the premature deaths. That's astonishing. That is a transformation. I mean, talk about a paradigm shift. A world where 8 times in 10 people do not get the heart attacks, cancer, stroke, diabetes, dementia, disabling arthritis, neurodegenerative disease, and so on that we see in the world around us. Incredible. So I said, that's what I've got to do. So that was really the inspiration. The fact that we had the knowledge of what, we just were not capable of the how. And I decided then and there, I need to focus on that translation. And most of the action, I did some research related to tobacco, but most of the action was nutrition because tobacco is simple. Smoking's bad, not smoking is much better. Physical activity is pretty simple. Sitting on our rear ends all the time is not so good. Getting up and moving around is much better.
Yeah.
But with diet, it's profoundly important, and yet there's also the opportunity to get lost and confused and misled. And I said that's a career. So that's where I was when the field of lifestyle medicine was later on named and invented. And I said, gee, that's where I've been all along. And so the rest is history.
Excellent, excellent explanation. Anthony, you have any questions you'd like to ask?
Yeah, I think, for the listeners, it might be great just to articulate, for example, the difference. I mean, you've already done a good job of it, but just to kind of paraphrase it, arguably thinking of lifestyle medicine versus conventional medicine, and obviously that preventative modality. But for the listeners, it might be great to kind of inform them of what the big difference is, and how we're, collectively working on some of these initiatives.
Sure. Well, again, first, I think everybody needs to understand how great the value proposition of getting lifestyle right is. So I've already said, if we got just the top three things in lifestyle right, if we ate well, were physically active, and didn't smoke, 80% of the chronic disease and premature death we see in the world around us could go away. And yes, by the way, this is true even during a pandemic, because overwhelmingly the high toll of COVID was COVID and people who had chronic disease succumbed to the disastrous effects of COVID. Other people got infected and recovered, but people who had diabetes or heart disease were the ones who didn't recover. So even during an acute infectious disease pandemic, getting lifestyle right and having intact health to start with would have made a massive difference. There are published papers suggesting that if we had no vaccines and no masks, but we had effectively addressed the pandemic of cardiometabolic disease, that in the US, the rate of hospitalization and death from COVID would have been reduced by 60%. So the value proposition, if you're listening, and by the way, you'll feel this immediately: more energy, more vitality, better concentration. I mean, all the things we all care about, right? Years in life, life in years. You immediately start to reap those benefits when lifestyle is your medicine. And what we're talking about really is 6 domains. I've summarized them as feet, forks, fingers, sleep, stress, and love. People use other terminology, but the gist of it would be feet, being physically active. We need that. Our bodies are made to move. We have to move it or lose it. Uh, Forks, dietary patterns. Again, it's the construction material for growing bodies of children. It's the construction material for replacing our spent cells and enzymes and hormones and all of that. And it's the fuel that runs this wondrous machine. Fingers, not bringing toxins to our lips, tobacco in particular, but also excess alcohol. Sleep, we need enough. Stress, we need to avoid too much. And love, we are social creatures. John Donne said it best: no one is an island. Human beings need one another. We're tribal. We thrive when we have good social connections. Feet, forks, fingers, sleep, stress, and love. So what lifestyle medicine does, Anthony, as you know, is say these are our domains of influence. And rather than watch health fall apart and prescribe medication, we're going to look at what's going on in each of these lanes and try to help patients optimize it. And we can do that with coaching. We can do this with digital therapeutics. We can do this with interventions like providing high quality food. We can do this by using advanced diagnostics like sleep studies to figure out what is wrong with your sleep architecture, what are the best ways to help. So there's nothing simplistic about it. It's not as if here just eat carrots and all will be well. It can be very sophisticated. It calls for different models of intervention to be effective because, here, just take this pill is an interaction of 10 seconds. I want to help you overhaul your diet is a much longer discussion. So lifestyle medicine is in the vanguard of group patient meetings, where instead of seeing one person for 9 minutes, you see 10 people at the same time for 90 minutes. And it's a really rich interaction. The education is much more expansive, and you're creating a supportive community into the bargain. And this group model of care has been well studied, and the results are very encouraging. When I was president of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, Anthony, I did raise one issue I think is critical, and that is lifestyle: how we eat, how much we move, how stressed out we are, how much and how well we sleep, social connections. If you think about it, well, gee, that kind of sounds more like a cultural issue than a clinical issue. And we have good evidence that that's true from the world's blue zones. So in the blue zones, characterized for all of us by National Geographic explorer Dan Buettner, and now quite famous, people routinely live to be 100 or more. They don't succumb to chronic disease. They live long, they prosper with vitality, and then they go gentle into that good night in the fullness of time, fall asleep one night and just don't wake up the next day. These are blessings. These are the blue zone blessings. And we all want them, but they don't get them there because their doctors are so terrific and their nurses are terrific. And they don't get there because of anything clinical. They get there because it's normal in those cultures, those 5 places around the world, normal to eat a diet of wholesome whole foods, mostly plants, normal to be physically active every day, do lots of walking, normal not to smoke, normal to sleep enough, normal not to be stressed out, and normal to have rich, well cultivated social and community connections. Feet, forks, fingers, sleep, stress, and love, they fire on all 6 cylinders. And the result is, more than 100 years of vital life. It's incredible, but it's entirely cultural. So when I was president of ACLM, I said, we really want to advocate for both. What should set lifestyle medicine apart is that we are both practicing clinical medicine differently, reversing diabetes, reversing heart disease, reversing inflammation, metabolic disease, enhancing health at its origins with lifestyle as literal medicine. But we also want lifestyle outside of the clinical domain to be supported by us. So we want to be cultural change agents and essentially make it normal in the places where we live and love and learn and work and pray and play. Make it normal to eat well, make it normal to be active, make it normal to avoid excess stress, make it normal to have healthy relationships where we support one another rather than tear one another down. Obviously, we've got miles to go before we sleep in terms of transforming culture, but there are many things that differentiate lifestyle medicine. The final thing I'll say is that the evidence is very strong when you make the intervention sufficiently intensive. We potency we ascribe to drugs and surgery. You can replace coronary artery bypass surgery with a lifestyle intervention. Dean Ornish has proven that, and his heart disease reversal program is reimbursed by Medicare and Medicaid to do exactly that. It's an alternative to CABG, coronary bypass surgery. We have seen the ability to prevent diabetes in high-risk individuals with lifestyle in the famous diabetes prevention program. And the lifestyle intervention, which was basically just improving diet, improving physical activity, and inducing weight loss as a byproduct of those, twice as good as the best medication we had to study at the time, metformin. And on and on it goes. The DASH studies, dietary approaches to stop hypertension, have shown that optimizing diet is every bit as effective to treat hypertension, something that encumbers over 50 million American adults, every bit as effective as the best pharmacotherapy. Make no mistake, lifestyle really is medicine, and the lifestyle medicine community is in the vanguard of advancing that awareness and putting it to best possible use.
Yeah. So,
Excellent.
I didn't know if there's any follow up to that, Anthony, or not. I mean, I can move on to the next question I have for
Yeah.
Dr. Katz. If not,
Yeah. Please.
okay.
Yeah.
So
Please go
Dr.
ahead.
Katz, you recently published an article that I saw that was titled "Bunk, Junk, and Food." I really like your sort of ways of tying things together. We've heard it a couple times already in this episode. So the one of the surprising things for me, and maybe it's not for people that are in the space, was that the American or the Journal of the American Medical Association also states that 2/3 of the diet of children aged 2 to 19 is made up of ultra processed foods. Can you tell us about what you believe the impact would be of having all these ultra processed foods?
Well, it's exactly the same impact on as you building the computer and studio equipment you're using now out of rusty, moth-eaten shards of scrap metal and hoping that it all holds together and works, right? I mean, basically, you're building stuff you care about out of junk. Right? Let's just let that hang out there, right? I mean, again, let me remind you from my point of view, and again, I think I've gone the miles to justify having an opinion here. Um, Food is the fuel that runs every aspect, every function of this extraordinary machine. And, we all, certainly everybody whose health is reasonably intact, has cause to marvel at this wondrous machine that is our body, the extraordinary range of things it does. But actually, if you're trained, you go to medical school for 4 years and learn everything about the human body and all the things that can go wrong with it. It's that much more wondrous. I mean, all the things that need to work with this elaborate choreography that just happens all the time. It's extraordinary, but you got to put fuel in every machine, and the fuel we put in this machine is food. And I mean, if you had a car, a device, anything remotely as wondrous as the human body to take care of, I mean, you would so very carefully source the fuel, right? I mean, people who own supercars, they don't
Right.
mess around and say, hey, let me try putting Jello in the tank and see if the thing runs. I mean, nobody would do that, right? I mean, it's $1 million car. I'm going to take really good care of it. It's precious. It's not as precious as your body,
Right.
and yet we routinely put junk in the tank. But it's the fuel. But as I said, with your studio, it's also the construction material, because obviously the growing body of a child, I mean, you just need to pause long enough to ask yourself, where's that extra height coming from? Can't come at, nothing comes from nothing. Everything comes from something. The something that we grow our children and grandchildren out of is literally the nutrients extracted from what they eat. And if you put in low quality food, you have low quality source material, you're building your child out of junk. So just ask
Yeah.
yourself, what thing you care about would you be willing to cobble together out of degraded material, weak material, junk? I suspect the answer is very few things you really care about. Do you want built out of junk? Your house out of, yeah, the woods, it's infested with termites. It's not going to hold up very well, but it'll get us through today. So let's build the whole house out of it. Nobody would do that. That's what we're
Yeah.
talking about. So you really can't overstate the impact
Yeah.
of junk where food ought to be on the human condition and on public health.
Yeah, and I saw a recent article as well. It says that there's a new higher incidence in people like 30 to 40 years old having cancer and things like that. And I mean, after seeing what you wrote about and then looking up the article out of the Journal of American Medical Association, I mean, I started to sort of piece these things together. I don't know if there is a direct corollary or not, but again, I would kind of tie this back to our microbiome. And are you feeding it things that nourish your microbiome, or you feeding it things that it just doesn't really care about? I mean, and honestly, would rather just pass.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a connection, Don, and we've seen evidence of this trend since the very early days of my career. So we're talking, going back 35 years or so. When I was in medical school, we were taught about two primary kinds of diabetes mellitus. We were taught about juvenile onset diabetes, type 1, basically the thing that happened usually in infancy, and adult onset diabetes. And those were the names: juvenile onset diabetes and adult onset diabetes. And the folks, certainly my contemporaries listening to this conversation, will all remember, oh, yeah, I remember that. But, we tend not to even think about it anymore, because for most of our lives, they've been called type 1 and type 2. And we take it for granted that type 2 diabetes is a thing that can happen to adults or children. And in fact, it's pretty rampant in kids. But it is the same condition that until, in certainly the geological timescale, very, very recently, was adult onset diabetes. In other words, kids never got it. What happened? Well, we had more and more junk where food ought to be. We had less and less opportunity for kids to have physical activity during their days. We had more and more childhood obesity. And what used to be a chronic disease of overweight, sedentary, middle-aged adults started creeping down into the pediatric realm to become a scourge there. And yes, you're absolutely right. What we're seeing is all of the major chronic diseases have been migrating down the age scale for decades now. And yes, we're actually doing a much better job of preventing cancer mortality, but that's because of advances in chemotherapy and immunotherapy, and to some extent screening technology. What we're not doing nearly so well is preventing people from getting cancer in the first place. And there, what we're seeing is it's actually happening at every younger age, as is heart disease, as is fatty liver disease, In fact, a leading indication for liver transplant in the United States, soon to be the leading indication, is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is secondary to obesity and insulin resistance. And we're seeing this in kids as well as adults. So yes, that is a consequence of junk where food ought to be, among other things. But that's the leading driver. And by the way, Don, just to finish, it is the leading driver. So we have studies, in particular, something called the Global Burden of Disease Study, making it quite clear that whereas back in 1993, when that paper I mentioned was published, Actual Causes of Death in the United States, tobacco was the leading cause of years lost from life and life lost from years in the US, followed by poor diet, lack of physical activity. In 2023, the single leading cause of premature death and chronic disease in the United States and much of the world is poor diet quality. Full stop. Number one.
Yeah, well, and through going through a lot of these podcast episodes, you guys are slowly converting me as well. So Anthony knows I'm walking my own journey here, trying to figure out the right way to find my way to the path that a lot of you guys are already on. Anthony, do you want to take the next question from here?
Yeah, certainly. And I guess one of the things, building off of, the topic of, junk, when I look at, let's say, consumer packaged goods and ultra processed foods, there's mechanisms or scoring systems to look at the degree of processing. There's one particular system in mind, but so this might be a two-part question. So in terms of ultra processed foods, what's your perspective on some of the scoring systems that exist out there to try to help consumers, make better or more informed choices? But then when you look also too, and the second part of that question would be when you look at the plethora of, let's say, labeling, mechanisms out there on products through various, different types of certifications. I wonder what your perspective is on that and how that's misdirecting, consumer choices as well.
Yeah, so two really good questions, Anthony. So the first is ultra processing and essentially scoring metrics. Yeah, so I'm a big fan of Nova. The work of Carlos Monteiro from University of Sao Paulo in Brazil and colleagues. And we sort of blithely make reference now to ultra processed foods, but it's an operational definition. There is a scale. And until very recently, junk food was the sort of thing where you knew it when you saw it, but nobody could really define it. What makes a particular food junk, and how much junkier is this than that? So I think Carlos and colleagues did us a huge favor. They quantified that, put it on a scale. And they're basically talking, when you get to the ultra processed end of the spectrum, you're talking about foods where the ingredients are not identifiable themselves as foods. They're basically texturizers and food chemicals and additives to change the flavor and change the texture. And it's pretty damn good. We have more and more evidence indicating that this scale, the NOVA classification for food processing, is a very potent correlate of all the outcomes we care about. So more ultra processed foods, more calorie consumption, more weight gain, more inflammation, more disruption of the microbiome, to tie back in a topic that Don raised, and on it goes. And it's early days in the research because we've only very recently gotten a quantified scale to use to do the study. And by the way, that's one of the things we should be saying thank you about. If we're just vaguely waving our hands and talking about junk food, and we all kind of know what we mean, I'm somebody who ran a clinical research lab for years. We can't do anything with that. Look, if I'm going to do a study of you're exposed to junk food and you're not, I need an operational definition of junk food. I need to be able to say you're getting, group A is getting it, group B is avoiding it. I have to know what it is, right? So you need a scale. You need a clearly articulated definition. We have that now, and the result is a burgeoning field of research where the effects of ultra processed food can be studied, and consistently the result is an indictment. Ultra processed food does this bad thing and that bad thing and all these other bad things. Every bad thing we thought it did, it does. And by the way, this is no surprise because food was ultra processed in the first place to satisfy the designs of the food industry. So let's go back before the work of Carlos Monteiro and Kevin Hall at the NIH, who's one of the leaders in studying the effects of ultra processed food. And let's look at the writing of Michael Moss, a Pulitzer Prize winning investigative journalist who has two books, Salt, Sugar, Fat, and Hooked, about the food industry. But everybody listening can look up his New York Times Magazine cover story. This is the title: The Extraordinary Science of Addictive Junk Food. So if you just Google Moss addictive, you'll pull this right up. It's a great read, very eye opening. So what Michael describes is how every major food company for years, so they knew what ultra processed food was, and they knew what ultra processed food did for years. They've been hiring teams of scientists, giving them functional MRI machines and marching orders to design food people couldn't stop eating until their arms got tired from lifting it to their mouths. And they used the functional MRI machines to see what combinations of stuff in food makes the human appetite center light up like a Christmas tree. So this has been mischief hiding in plain sight, mischief and manipulation hiding in plain sight for a very long time. And now the research is starting to reveal, yeah, it does all the bad things we expected it to do. So I really like and am a strong proponent of using the NOVA classification. Does it occasionally get it wrong, Anthony? I mean, is there something, where you might say this registers as ultra processed because it's got a long ingredient list, but actually the ingredients are all good? I suppose there's the occasional edge case and people make a fuss about that. But I've conferred closely with Professor Montero, and those edge cases are very few and far between. It mostly gets it right. On the other matter, and you may know this, Anthony, in a former life, I actually developed a scoring system for the overall nutritional quality of foods. And that's what it was called, the Overall Nutritional Quality Index, the ONQI, ONQI. And it saw daylight as a system called NuVal. That was the commercial expression of it. Some of you may have encountered it. It was in 2,000 supermarkets at its peak throughout the United States. And we had an elaborate algorithm, a 30-page computer program that considered over 30 distinct nutrient entries, good and bad, weighting coefficients for the various health effects, and I'll spare you the gory details, but it was rather mind-numbing. But it spit out a number, and we put it on a scale from 1 to 100. The higher the number, the more nutritious the food. And we tested it to make sure that those numbers correlated with health outcomes like all-cause mortality, and they did. And we tested it to make sure that if you put it in the store, it changed behavior and people bought better stuff. And it did, and they did. And anyway, it was a little too good for the food system to tolerate, so the food giants kind of ganged up on it and killed it over about a 10-year period. But I'm a fan of that sort of actionable information at the point of purchase. That's empowering, right? So look, it doesn't help me to, I'm playing the role of, the average busy shopper who's got a family to feed. It doesn't help me to know that broccoli is better than Captain Crunch because I'm not giving my family broccoli for breakfast. There'll be a mutiny.
Right.
But it would help me a lot to know as I'm shopping for, breakfast cereal, which breakfast cereal is the best. Can I find a breakfast cereal that my family likes that's much, much better at about the same price? If it's better nutritionally and they'll eat it, it tastes good, and it won't cost me a lot more, and maybe even cost me less, yeah, I'll give it a try. And by the way, ditto in every other aisle of the supermarket when I'm shopping for bread and yogurt and pasta sauce and salad dressing and salty snacks and all that stuff. I know the produce aisle is good for me. I got that. I got that memo. So I'll try to spend some time there. But again, I'm not feeding broccoli for breakfast, so help me. And so that's what Anki and the NuVal did. And there are other systems that purport to do the same. I think some of them are useful. I think some of them are not that useful. I mean, the traffic light system, one of the reasons it's so popular around the world is it looks like you're helping people without really helping them enough to offend the food industry. Because, I mean, the way those things work is you get, green, yellow, red for saturated fat, and green, yellow, red for sodium, and green, yellow, red for added sugar, and green, yellow, red for calories. And so you're looking basically at a kaleidoscope and saying, okay, I've got two yellows, one green, and one red. Is that good? Is that better or worse than three yellows and two greens? And I mean, basically you've got choice paralysis, which is the very thing you're trying to fix. One number, the higher the number, the more nutritious the food. That's the kind of system I think we need, and it should have the full might of public health behind it. I hope I live to see that day. I've moved on from that project. I've spent years of my life working on that, only to see the food industry crush it. So I've moved in another direction. But yeah, I think that's potentially extremely valuable. And the goal should be No offense to anybody, but the average nutritional nincompoop, sorry, should be able to shop as effectively for better nutrition as effectively as the world's leading nutrition experts. If you do an algorithm right, you do a scoring system right, that's how empowered you should be. So I know nothing about nutrition. I'm a total nincompoop, but I can make choices about bread and cereal and pasta and yogurt and everything in the store as reliably as, you know, Frank Hugh, the chair of nutrition at Harvard. That's what we're shooting for. And by the way, Frank was one of the people who helped me work on the Anki, as was his predecessor in that role, Walter Will, and many other luminaries. Yeah, we could do that, but we need public health and industry to cooperate to let that kind of empowerment get to daylight and thrive, because what's in the best interest of public health may or may not be in the best interest of large companies that thrive by selling junk where food ought to be.
So, in preparation for our interview, I read the book that you and Mark Bittman wrote. By the way, I saw Mark Bittman's name kind of here and there, and other things that you published as well. So, I mean, I noticed that you sort of co-authored together a few things. But the title of the book is How to Eat and All Your Food and Diet Questions Answered. I love the format of the book because it's more or less sort of the key questions that people are going to ask. And Anthony and I were having this discussion in preparation for the show, and I said, look, I mean, oftentimes, where I've gone, and it's not always the healthiest choice that I could possibly make, but I've always gone that your body or your mind wouldn't crave things if it weren't for the fact that you were meant to intake some of these things. And I feel like you guys adequately answer this in terms of like meat protein in the book for somebody like me, because that it's my fallback. It's like, look, why, if I'm not supposed to consume meat all the time, why does my body and my mind sort of want this, all the time? And the answer given in the book, by the way, I thought was brilliant. It was essentially, look, I mean, if you go back to whenever meat was more scarce, sure, your body and your mind need to crave it because the whole goal was to get you up and go hunt, but you're not going to be successful in every hunt, and so you're going to come back and you're still going to have to eat some of the things that are around and available at that point in time. And I felt like that was just a great answer for somebody like me that's sitting by the sideline. But I mean, are there any other answers about why we crave the foods that are just not good for us?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for the bookshop. And let me just make a shout out to Mark Bittman, who's awesome. Good friend and, genuinely wise person, with a great perspective on sort of the food landscape. His vision, when it comes to details about how, metabolic pathways and such, I'm your guy. But, why the food industry is the way it is, why agriculture is the way it is, how did we get into this mess in the first place? Mark's your guy, and Mark and Michael Pollan I sort of think of as in that rarefied space. And by the way, he has another fantastic book for those of you who want to know more about agriculture and the role that it's played and where we are and how we got here from where we started, called Animal Vegetable Junk. That's Mark's latest book, Animal Vegetable Junk, and it's terrific. I learned a ton reading that book. But anyway, thanks. Yeah. So How to Eat, I think it's a really nice book. And so we did a couple pieces for New York Magazine together on the last conversation you'll ever need to have about diet. And inevitably, after the last conversation, they wanted a sequel. So it wasn't quite the last conversation. And then we did two last conversations. And then Mark's publisher found us and said, "Hey, have you guys got more? Because we could do a whole book on a last conversation." So all your questions answered, and I'm sure there are still more questions. But we had a lot of fun doing it, and we wrote it very conversationally. So it's like pulling, and I hope you felt that way, Don. It's like,
Yes.
hey, we're at a coffee table chatting about all things nutrition. Pull up a chair, join us. So on that issue, can you count on cravings to drive you in the direction of what you actually need? The answer is absolutely not. It's absolutely not for two reasons. First, Dorothy, you are not in the Stone Age anymore, right? So we were just talking about the fact we have junk where food ought to be. So natural systems work very well in natural context. Our appetite center works well. We feel full when we should feel full if we're eating actual food. So if we eat real food direct from nature, we're very unlikely to overeat. We're very unlikely to eat in a very unbalanced way. Our cravings will reliably guide us. But when food is being willfully engineered by PhDs fiddling around with functional MRI machines to induce overeating, can you count on your Stone Age cravings to guide you? Hell no. No, no, no hope. So the first answer is these cravings are, biologically endowed to us for a natural world that no longer exists. We've completely adulterated the food supply, and the simplistic, powerful guidance of natural systems is corrupted by an unnatural foodscape. So no, you cannot rely on them. And then the second is, Don, and this too, makes good sense in the context of evolutionary biology. A very potent driver of dietary preference, especially in omnivores, is familiarity.
Mm.
You crave what you're used to. So if you're given a bad diet as a child, and most Americans are, if you're exposed to a bad diet even before that in utero, because your mother's diet's not terrific, and most of our mother's diets are not, because, hey, welcome to America, you actually are habituated to the flavor distribution, the nutrient distribution of whatever your exposure was. And that too makes sense, because if you are the beneficiary of, sort of a tribal legacy where people are thriving and eating what they should, you want to learn to eat it too. So one of the most consistent determinants of dietary preference is familiarity. And so, your cravings and aversions relate to that. And if you are brought up on a diet that's not terrific for you, you still think of it as terrific because it's the diet you know, and you learn to love the one you're with. Now, this all could sound pretty bleak, as if you're destined to crave all the wrong things forever, but you're not, because fortunately, taste buds are adaptable little fellas, and they do really well with taste bud rehab. So you can incrementally improve your food choices. Trade up here, trade up there, pick this instead of that, and little by little familiarize your palate with better stuff. And there are some really good studies in the scientific literature demonstrating, and I experienced this taking care of patients for 30 years, um, that taste buds adapt. When they can't be with the foods they used to love, they learn to love the foods they're with. And so you don't have to choose between the pleasure of enjoying your food and the pleasure of enjoying good health. If you commit to the incremental process of taste bud rehab as you try to trade up the quality of your diet, you absolutely can love the foods that love you back. And that's been demonstrated again and again. But it may require a transformation, and you cannot rely on Stone Age cravings for protein or meat or any other thing to reliably guide you to good food choices in a world of ultra processed junk and golden arches.
Excellent. So we're up to our last couple of questions. Anthony, did you want to ask a follow up, and then I'll have one more for you, and we'll
Sure.
wrap up here.
Sure. So I guess again, a two-part question. So number one, again, I think there's some emerging research looking at how the gut microbiome itself influences cravings. So it would be great to get your perspective or thoughts on that. And then I guess the second question related back to comments about the food industry, where again, many of the food companies out there leverage these sophisticated like tasting modalities to influence, let's say eating decisions. What advice do you have for, let's say, small, food companies that want to actually align to more of this lifestyle medicine modality? How do they basically play, and how can they differentiate themselves from some of the other companies, that are out there?
Wow, that's an expansive range of topics right there, from the microbiome to corporate America and how to thrive in it. So, in terms of the microbiome, here's how I recommend people think of it, because the last thing people need, Anthony, is complication, right? So, if the idea is, well, I thought I knew how to feed myself, but now I need to think about what to feed my microbiome because it may influence what I eat. And so I've it then becomes more complicated. It's one more thing to think about. And I don't think people need to do that. The microbiome is monumentally important. It's a fundamental part of us. We have more bacteria in our bodies than we have cells. It doesn't just take a village to raise a human being, it takes a village to be a human being. It's critically important. But so is your liver, so is your heart, so are your kidneys. And you don't, before you sit down for a meal, you don't ask, okay, is this, You don't have a checklist. What does my liver need? What do my kidneys need? What do my adrenal glands need? What's my pituitary gland need? You have choice paralysis again, right? I mean, I just have to go through all the vital organs and make
Yeah.
sure they're all okay. The simple empowering truth here is that what's good for parts of us is good for all of us. What's good for all of us is good for parts of us. And the microbiome is just a critically important part of us. So I would argue, if you make an effort to improve your diet quality, if you commit to taste bud rehab, right, trading up, learning how to do that, and pursuing that to a better dietary pattern, it will recomposition your microbiome, and it will recomposition your microbiome. And there are many studies to show this, as you well know, Anthony, that dietary pattern influences the composition of the microbiome. And as you improve the quality of your diet, the composition of your microbiome changes in a way that lends positive reinforcement. So you actually, it does, yes, it does affect what you want to eat and what you crave and what you prefer. And it moves in tandem with the direction you have chosen. So if you're improving your diet quality, eating more whole plants, in particular more vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds, your microbiome will reinforce that and be better for you overall because less inflammation, all the good stuff. If you went in the other direction, so I'm going to eat a lot more beef and ultra processed food, you there too, you change the composition of your microbiome. And yes, it does change your cravings so that they move in the direction you've chosen to go. A bad direction for you and for the planet, by the way. So yes, it's part of the overall formula. But the good news is you don't have to think, what do I do for my microbiome in order to get it right for yourself? As long as you get it fundamentally right. And let's remember, Michael Pollan distilled it all down to 7 words: eat food, not too much, mostly plants. There it is right there, right? If you mostly eat vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds, and mostly drink plain water when thirsty, whatever else you do is probably going to be okay. Just mostly do that. You and your microbiome will do fine. On the issue of whether the microbiome affects motivation and preference, it was a really interesting study recently. I think it was in one of the Nature imprints. It was a mouse study, so whether or not this will translate to people, I have no idea, but they willfully altered the microbiome composition of the mice, and they found that it changed the motivation, not for food, they weren't studying that, but for exercise. So actually motivation to exercise varied with microbiome composition in mice. Really interesting. So I mean, one of the potential implications for people is eat better, be healthier, have a healthier microbiome, have the healthier microbiome reinforce your motivation to eat better. And oh, by the way, maybe have your microbiome give you a kick in the backside and say, get up and move too, because you now have greater motivation. I mean, it's really cool stuff. So stay tuned. There's a lot more research to happen. But again, the good news from a point of what do I do is use the stuff you already know about eating well. Yes, it will change your microbiome, and it will change it in a way that reinforces your commitment to eating better. On the issue of what do the good actors do in a food industry that's predominated by people peddling highly profitable junk where food ought to be. I as an entrepreneur myself, I run a company now trying to make diet quality a vital sign. That's my current professional mission. I would say, you think about how innovation works its way through the marketplace. You first find fellow innovators, people who are looking for, so they know that stuff is broken and they're looking to solve it. So there are a lot of educated people who understand the liabilities of ultra processed food. They understand they're being lied to by big food companies that, essentially are making breakfast cereal primarily out of sugar, and then put in big letters on the front of the package, fortified with 11 essential vitamins and minerals, part of a complete breakfast. Yes, it's the horrible part of a complete breakfast. It's a box of sugar with a multivitamin thrown in. Step away from the box and nobody will get hurt. There are people who know that, and they're looking for good alternatives. So first you become the good alternative. And then you try to grow from there, because then they become a groundswell of support for you, and you move from innovators to early adopters to early majority. There is more and more awareness. More and more of the public understands the liabilities of ultra processing. Carlos Montero's work on Nova is your friend if you're trying to market good stuff. The American College of Lifestyle Medicine is your friend if you're trying to market good stuff. So there's a corporate roundtable at the American College of Lifestyle Medicine that allows for private sector entities like food companies to join and say, we want you to guide us so we do this right. And then we want access to your population, people who are looking for solutions, because we want to do well and do good, so we can help one another. I founded a nonprofit some years ago, the True Health Initiative, and we were trying to be, and still are trying to be, an amplifier for virtuous companies, especially in the food space, and said you can be an organizational member of the True Health Initiative. And what that tells the world is it's not just you saying you're really making good stuff, because all the food companies find a way to say our stuff is good, right? Fortified with 11 essential vitamins and minerals is an example. They never say this is junk and put skull and crossbones on the front of the package, even when they should. They always accentuate the positive. So it is hard for the really good actors to differentiate themselves. So let us do it for you. We will only allow you to be a corporate member of the True Health Initiative if what you make and what you do and how you market and what you tell the public truly aligns with our principles, which are predicated on science, sense, and the global consensus of experts. But if we allow you to become a member, an organizational member, then we will amplify your messages and try to elevate the reliable signals above the constant noise. Have we solved the problem? No. Do we have a lot of work left to do? Yes. Is there going to be a huge issue overcoming the marketing might of the big companies? I mean, you know what the problem is, Anthony. The biggest companies are the ones that make junk. They have massive war chests, and they can outspend us 100 to 1 or 1,000 to 1 on advertising. That's not going to go away anytime soon. But as the public becomes more sophisticated, as good information starts to prevail, the audience that can differentiate truth about food and true food from false advertising is growing. And I'm hopeful about the future, both for public health and for private sector rewards for people who are doing this the right way.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks so much for sharing all of that. And so, Dr. Katz, if people wanted to find out more about you and wanted to figure out where to connect with you, how could they find your work and where would they go?
So, after a 30 some odd year span in academic medicine, I am an entrepreneur now, and my company is Diet ID. Our website is dietid.com. Please visit, see what we do. This is where I focus my efforts these days. And then I have a website that's a hub to all the other things I do, davidkatzmd.com. And one of the things you'll find a link to there is my wife's recipe site, freely available. All the Katz family greatest hits at your disposal. It's great. That's Quizinicity. But dietid.com, davidkatzmd.com.
Excellent. And thank you so much for being here. I greatly appreciate all of your time and all the answers to our questions and spending time with us. I appreciate it.
Pleasure, gentlemen. Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Thanks so much.